Hi, I'm David Tao, and welcome again to the Theories of Everything program. Viewers, this is the third program in our big picture series, Theories of Self, in which we examine notions of identity and notions of memory and emotions and feelings and personality, all the elements that go to make us the way we are. It's a very big picture indeed. It goes right to the core of what we are, who we are, and how we interact with others. And in this first program, one of the most startling things that we discovered in the latest theories was that there is no ghost in the machine. There is no central executive point in the brain that governs and controls everything else at a conscious level. This notion, this early Cartesian notion, René Descartes proposed this notion that there is a central focal point that controls everything in the brain. This has been overturned, of course, by the use of magnetic resonance imaging techniques, brain scanning techniques in recent years, which have shown that all the connections, all the elements of the brain, there may be focal points, there may be specialist functional areas in the brain that perform different functions, but all of them combine, all of them integrate to create what we are and to give us that feeling of consciousness. Because again, one of the things that we discussed, one of the things that modern neuroscience has discovered, is that most of the critical decisions in our lives are made at the subconscious level. An illusion is created, if you like, when that decision is made and it's passed to the conscious level, and we think we've made that decision consciously. But if we take ordinary everyday things, such as recognising a face, avoiding a car, driving, running, jumping, whatever it is, even at the creative level, creating new knowledge, having breakthroughs in creating new ideas, all those elements, all those interactions are done at the subconscious level. What we get at the conscious level is feedback on how we're going. The sort of words I'm saying now to you. I'm getting feedback constantly on whether those words are correct, whether they're following the sort of path that I have planned for the program. But that's a secondary feedback loop, if you like. It allows us to adapt, to learn further. Even decisions, in fact, that we think relate to free will, such as what sort of job I'll follow, what sort of career, whether you like someone or not. When you think about those sorts of things, whether you want to be an aeronautical engineer or a taxi driver or a biologist, when you think of those options really and which one you'll follow, at least in part of your life, those decisions have been formulated, gestated, and created probably from the very beginnings of your life. The sort of people you admired, the stories you read, the things you saw on TV about a particular scientist or a particular manager or whatever it was, whatever your parents have said, what teachers have said, what others in your peer group said when you were going to school. All these things are mixed and matched together at the subconscious level in the brain, and over time you come to the conclusion, yes, I'll be a doctor, I'll be a bookseller, whatever. And then you come to the conclusion, yes, I want to do this. I've planned it, I've formulated it, I want to do this. But in fact, let's say 90% of that decision was made at the subconscious level. And so it goes. So the whole notion of free will coming out of this subconscious is very interesting, because our free will, in fact, which we didn't speak at length about in our first program, is not only created at that subconscious level, but is created within very strict restraints of our culture as well. For example, you couldn't have been an aeronautical engineer a century ago when planes were first being invented. Flight was first being formulated. It didn't exist, those sorts of jobs. So obviously that would have been excluded from your option list. There may be certain physical restrictions. Once you had to be very tall, very very large to be a policeman, not these days. Whatever it was, there were and still are restraints. As our technologies develop, those restraints at the physical level and even at the mental level become fewer and fewer as our understandings grow and we can compensate for any variations that need to be overcome. So free will is a little bit of a mirage. You can talk about free will in terms of possible options, potential options, and we select actions and make decisions within frameworks, within relative frameworks. Again, we could devote a whole show to free will, but we'll move on, because in that second program we found that the glue that links all the interactions together, the interactions at that subconscious level, are of course memories, whether they're short-term or long-term. We understood in that program that memories are created from links between neurons, networks of neurons, often hundreds or thousands of them, connected by electrical impulses, neurotransmitters, etc. Long-term potentiation is one phenomenon that we talked about. When you repeat a certain memory or process over and over, you strengthen the connections and you link those neurons together much more strongly. We talked about association of memories with events, with sounds and sights and smells, etc. That's all being understood now at the molecular level. This is the difference. Previously it was understood by us in a general, very general way, in our own way, if you like. We related to ourselves in that way through introspection, through that conscious feedback loop, understanding what our body was doing and why we were making decisions. But in fact philosophers also thought in those terms as well. But now we have the technology to understand it at the molecular level. The processes that are put in train when we remember something. For example, the process of memory now is becoming very well understood indeed. But the memories link us together, link all the events in our lives together from early childhood to the time that we die, and create this so-called stream of consciousness. The memories smooth it out. We retain this identity. Sometimes people can't retain that identity. It gets fragmented. It gets depersonalised. But in general terms, we retain that because the memories are linked together again in our subconscious. And we retain that sense of continuity, the sense of I, the sense of identity. However, one big chunk that we've left out and which we're covering in today's program, of course, are the drivers for the way we feel, for the reasons that we act. The drivers, of course, are the emotions. And linked to those emotions are feelings, which we'll discuss, the difference between the two. And the combination of all those emotions and feelings and memories and experiences create our personality. Viewers, the origins of emotions are evolutionary. Emotions probably occurred in some of the very earliest species. They evolved because they had to for the animal's survival. Emotions such as pain and pleasure, for example, were probably the two first. But later on, happiness, joy, sadness, the social emotions of guilt, embarrassment, empathy, compassion, etc. also evolved and also assisted in survival, the organism's survival. Obviously, if you did something detrimental to the group, as a group, which most species formed after a certain level of complexity, then that jeopardised the survival of the group as a whole. So there had to be some feedback to provide that animal with and some punishment, if you like, rather as opposed to a reward that showed them that they'd made some sort of error and jeopardised the group survival and therefore their own survival. So in many cases, all these emotions, of course, survive in later species, and there's a debate going on as to whether emotions exist in dogs and cats and horses and so forth. But I think most of us have an understanding now, and certainly the neuroscientists and biologists have an understanding that this is the case. One can just see it. If you tread on the tail of a cat or don't feed it at the right time or whatever, it'll show the same sort of emotions as a child in many cases. Now, if we take that a stage further, we'll see that there must have been certain structures that evolved in the brain to focus these emotions, and they did. There are two major structures. The amygdala, for example, that's a twin almond-shaped focus functional centre in the forebrain, and also the prefrontal cortex, which is behind the forehead, is another major centre. That centre was assumed to be more a centre for planning, and rather than emotions. But lately, in more recent studies, particularly in the 90s, it's been discovered that indeed it is a centre for emotion as well. On the left frontal, the left forebrain are more emotions, centres emotions of happiness, for example, and on the right-hand side, negative emotions. The amygdala, for example, is more about the emotions of fear and surprise and shock, and also anger. So they have each evolved probably at different times and different stages. The prefrontal cortex is obviously a more recent development, and but they exist there, and they cover the whole gamut of emotions between them. Now, if we take, for example, one of the major survival emotions, pleasure, even there's been some new understandings very recently of how that works, how we receive pleasure for things that improve our survival rate, whether it's food or sex, but in more recent times, acquisition of knowledge perhaps, music, creativity in general. You can see that as time has gone by, these emotions have evolved and diversified like everything else in our complex organism and in our complex environment. So the pleasure itself, there used to be the original model was that there was a pleasure centre, and it was based on the release of the dopamine neurotransmitter. When it was stimulated, it caused the animal to feel pleasure and to continue doing what it was doing, to gain that pleasure. Now, in very recent times, though, an alternate model has surfaced, because there's now a distinction. It's realised there is a distinction between desire and pleasure, and happiness, if you like. Pleasure is invoked with the release of opoids, a class of molecules called opoids, which includes endorphins, encephalins, and very similar to heroin and morphine, for example. So you can see where that link is, why it's so powerful. So this has been an important breakthrough, and it also comes into modern thinking about happiness and desire. It's understood now from recent experiments with humans, if you like, that materialism alone doesn't produce happiness, which we all suspected and we all knew, and has been the subject of countless books, articles and films. The acquisition of bigger houses and cars and money itself is triggered probably by desire, because it can produce improve the survival of the person in difficult times, but it doesn't produce happiness. Happiness, unless it's at a very, a shift from a very substandard level of living to a higher level. But once reached a certain threshold of survival, it doesn't improve happiness a lot. What does improve happiness is better social networks, a better partner relationship. The social relationships produce the happiness in humans and probably in most other mammals. So that's a very interesting finding. But it also comes to the bigger issue, a new theory, if you like, relating to emotions and feelings. Emotions, as I say, have existed because of an evolutionary need to get feedback when we've done something bad, wrong, something that jeopardises survival of the individual or the group. However, they exist all the time. They can be triggered from external events, pain, anger, happiness, etc. But the feeling is the feedback. We have to have the feedback. If we don't have that feedback, and that occurs sometimes in humans, and they don't feel fear or happiness, or in other words, they're disassociated from their emotions. The emotions may be there, but they can't feel them. So you need both. Feeling is that feedback that tells you what's going on at the emotional level, just as consciousness is the feedback that tells you what's going on at the subconscious level. It's a very interesting parallel pathway there. So this is the new theory of emotions and feelings. Both are essential. At the opposite end of the spectrum, the emotional spectrum to joy and happiness, we have sadness. Sadness from loss or grief. We have further emotions such as related to anxiety, and if we go further across the spectrum we have pathological outcomes such as depression and neuroses of various sorts. Some would argue that these are still of evolutionary advantage, but others would say no, they need to be eliminated as quickly as possible, and in this modern age, because times are different, the evolutionary threats are different. Now, in modern humans, these sorts of threats, or threats to equilibrium, if you like, in relatively small cases, threats perhaps not enough food, not enough water, larger threats such as an imminent predator or imminent major risk of annihilation. All of these are mediated in modern humans by two centres. The major one, the amygdala, which has come to prominence, really come to prominence in the last 5 years, as a major direct emotional key centre in the brain. And when a threat is received via a sensory input, via the thalamus to the amygdala, down then through to the brainstem, down to the adrenal glands, where hormones such as adrenaline and glucocorticoids in the form of cortisol are pumped out to prepare that organism to face or avoid the threat. This is the traditional pathway, the older pathway if you like. The newer pathway goes through the cortex in modern humans, which allows more sophisticated reasoning regarding the threat, but there may not be time in some instances. So both pathways have been retained by evolution. Now, the amygdala is very good at retaining memories, emotional memories of threats. It actually acts as a sifting function, because not all inputs to it are major threats. So it has at the molecular level, it has a process of generating negative ions which inhibit positive ions which could trigger reactions. So this is very valuable. So it's not just to pump out stress-related hormones, it's also to decide whether a threat is a real threat or not. That's and it is also capable of setting up long-term potentiation, which we discussed in our memory program. In other words, establishing very long-term memories relating to primal fear, primal major threats, etc., which has been extremely important in our evolutionary past and probably still is. Those memories, as I mentioned, can be, in the previous program, can be reversed. All memories can be changed. They have to be dynamic because they have to integrate recent current information about the environment, about the world, about relationships with the older memories, because things do change and memories can be valuably updated. A simple instance, if you've grown up in a house, your memories as a child would be that the rooms were huge and very large, and when you're an adult, the rooms come back to normal size, and you factor that in with your original memory. You may retain some of those original memories, but in other instances it may be integrated to form a new memory. And this has to happen continuously, so memories do have to be flexible and dynamic. And in the case of very, very powerful emotional type memories, they can be reversed. If we take the case of a rat that receives a shock, an associated bell rings at the same time, it will go into a very anxious state if it cannot do anything about that threat. And in fact, if it's particularly helpless, doesn't have any support, as humans may not also, it may go into a state of depression. In other words, normally stress hormones are activated for a short time and then the threat goes away, but if there's a continuous threat, it will build up. These neuroses will build up. These emotional neuroses will build up in the animal. and have a long-term detrimental effect. So it has to be able to be capable of being reversed, and it can be, if the bell only rings and the shock doesn't follow for a long time, it can gradually be reversed. And this sort of treatment is applied in humans to human cases as well. So we have this spectrum of emotions which are tied into our cognition, tied into every aspect of our lives, in fact. And we come, then the question has to be asked is, are these emotions, do they get settled into a sort of a pattern in terms of traits, in terms of our personalities? Well, yes, they do. Because there is a genetic disposition at work here. In other words, personalities have been categorised into about 5 levels. 2 of those are a sort of neurotic personality, someone who's constantly anxious, constantly on edge, nervous, and finds it hard, is introverted, for example. And the other personality complex may be personality, gregarious, outgoing, looking for novelty, willing to try new things. So in each case there is a molecular basis, a genetic basis. In fact, found that up to 80% of personality traits, behavioural traits, are governed primarily by genes, at the genetic level at least, and not by the environment, such as parental upbringing and so forth. That comes as a bit of a shock now to a lot of people, but the experiments have been done and it appears that this is indeed the case. Take the neurotic person, for example. They seem to release a protein, have a gene that releases, or a form of a gene that releases a protein that pumps out serotonin from its normal position between connecting cells back into the particular cell. In fact, Prozac has been applied to reverse that process in people who have depression. In other words, it inhibits the uptake of serotonin. That comes about because there are 2 forms of that particular gene. They're called an allele. One gene will do that, another gene won't. The same gene in a different form won't. And there can be also different lengths of promoter sequences, because genes have to be initiated through transcription factors acting on the promoter regions adjacent to the gene. And even different lengths of promotion DNA, promoter DNA, will have different effects. So just small variations in the same gene can change someone's personality and behaviour. And in fact, this is very evident. For example, in men who have been mistreated as boys, perhaps some will become violent when they reach adulthood, others won't, no matter how badly they've been mistreated. And that apparently is to do with a particular gene that can exist in 2 forms. The same goes for binding with partners, monogamy and polygamy. There seems to be the release of a hormone when a rat has mated with a female, vasopressin, and that in one form of the gene will switch on a binding process so that rat will be locked into that female for life, monogamy in other words. In the other case, in the other form of the same gene, it won't have any effect and the rat will be polygamous, and that can be applied to humans as well. It can be correlated with the divorce rate, in other words. So we find that understanding these mechanisms at the molecular level is very, very important, and is really starting to happen now, because when you get conditions such as debilitating diseases, conditions such as major depression, etc., there's an opportunity, major anxiety, neuroses, there's an opportunity to reverse and change that process and change that person's quality of life. Even there's been recent dialogue between Buddhist monks, for example, and neuroscientists, because it's been discovered that the Buddhist monks' form of meditation, which focuses on pleasant things, pleasant thoughts, joyful things, if you like, has produced re-engineered changes in the brain, in the frontal lobes, one of which codes for pleasant, optimistic outcomes, the other codes for more negative thoughts. In Buddhist monks, that is much larger than in the average person, the positive lobe, the left-hand one. The right-hand one is much smaller than the average person. So through sheer thought, sheer analysis, sheer meditation, humans can alter their brain patterns. So that is a very good prognosis for the future. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program again. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.